So it's interesting to think about why people use drugs and alcohol. And there's kind of three big categories. One is just for the thrill of it. It's a pleasure effect, and I'll talk about that this morning. It's mediated by dopamine. The second reason people use drugs and alcohol is in order to avoid negative emotions. People often find they're lonely, or they're bored, or they're angry, or they're anxious, nervous, they have social anxiety, and they find that alcohol or drugs make them feel better and cover up those emotions. And the third is because drugs and alcohol kind of introduce you to a magical kind of world that's a little bit more exciting than the regular world. It sort of opens up possibilities, almost like you're going through into Alice in Wonderland sort of place. But today I'm going to talk about the thrill aspect, and that's really mediated by dopamine. So dopamine is a molecule in what we call the pleasure center of the brain, which is a very primitive part of the brain, right in the middle of the brain, the automatic part of the brain that keeps our body breathing when we're asleep, and it keeps our temperature regulated. So all the things we don't have to think about. And dopamine has been called the pleasure molecule. So its purpose is really to keep our species alive, and so it does that by giving us cravings for food and sex, basically. So without those kind of basic needs, our species doesn't survive, and so we have strong cravings for food, and we have strong cravings for sex. And those are very powerful cravings. In fact, they're so powerful that we now have 7 billion humans on the planet, so clearly the cravings are strong, and we follow those cravings. As far as food goes, we now live in a world where there's lots of food around, and so we have a big obesity problem because the cravings are strong, and we end up giving into them. But drugs and alcohol basically release more dopamine than our brain was ever meant to get, probably 4 or 5 times as much dopamine. And so when we do alcohol and drugs, we get this thrill, we get this incredible, intense pleasure. And once we've had that, we really like it, and we want to do it again and again, and keep going. Some drugs release dopamine more quickly, like cocaine does that much stronger, but all addictive drugs release dopamine in the pleasure center. And so when we do use those things, we feel this intense pleasure, and we want to keep going. What happens next is that our frontal lobes, or the thinking part of our brain, starts noticing that we got this dopamine rush, we got this pleasure feeling, and then it wants to know, how can we get it again, and how can we do things. And so it changes the brain, and it creates strong pathways to the thinking part of the brain, so that we then prioritize, and we value that experience, so we want to do it over and over again. So the pleasure is a huge part of why people use drugs. It's thrilling, it's exciting, and it's one of the big reasons.